Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Taylor Ann, and right now I am here with Peter Schmuck. He is the Maryland Sportswriter of the Year. Congratulations on your accomplishment. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Taylor. I appreciate you chiming in.
Of course. So you worked for the Baltimore Sun before most recently retiring in 2020, and you are a 7-time NSMA award winner, which is amazing. We are going to jump right in with some questions right now.
Okay.
So, Mr. Schmuck, how did you enter the sports writing field?
Kind of accidentally. I was came up during the All the President's Men era of journalism, where we all wanted to be investigative White House reporters and change the world. Got out of college, and there weren't those kind of jobs for everybody at that time. It was a really tight job market, and I got offered a stringer position at the Orange County Register in California. And as you probably know, stringer position's about 6 levels down from intern, which we would get $20 cash per game to cover a couple high school games each weekend. And that was all I could get. And fortunately, that led to me getting a part-time job at the Orange County Register, which quickly evolved because of some attrition there into a full-time sports writer job when I was about 22. And within a year or so of that, I was a baseball writer, which was just a freak of nature to be get that position in those days. It was a huge perk beat, and all the older guys had those beats, and they never gave them up. And so it just so happened that a couple of the writers on the staff who had covered the California Angels had family issues that required them to leave the beat mid-season. And after that happened for the second time, I was in the office as a desk guy, working on the rim. The sports editor came out one day and said, and he said it with an expletive to begin with, bleep, bleep, I'm never sending another married guy on the baseball beat. Who in here isn't married? And I'm the only guy that raised his hand. And that's how I got the Angels beat at the Orange County Register, and I was a baseball writer for the next 41 straight years.
Wow, that's a really interesting story.
I can make it better for you.
Please.
I'm the first to admit that virtually everything that's happened to me has had a huge luck component. And young people like yourself should know that you should never pass up or feel bad about getting a lucky break. It's just part of the whole process. When I went in for the stringer position, you had to pass a little test. And this older gentleman named Art Para, a sweet old guy, had to give me this test. He put a typewriter in front of me. In those days, it was typewriters, not word processors or laptops. And he said, he gave me a piece of paper that had 4 or 5 high school football stats, and a couple names, first names, and said, I need a 6-inch story in 10 minutes. Now, I'd never written a sports story in my life. I'd written a lot of stories because I was on the newspaper staff at Cal State Fullerton in Orange County. And so I sat down and, I'd read enough sports stories to know you write the score in the first paragraph, and you put a couple stats in each paragraph after that. And there's only 5 paragraphs. So I wrote it, and it was awful. And I knew that I'd blown this whole thing. And I pulled the thing out and I handed it to him. I had my head down, and he holds it up and he's looking at it and he's looking at it. And then he goes, this is great. You're hired. And so the punchline to all this is that sadly, after I had gotten the job and I'd gotten on the payroll as a part-timer, Art retired because his eyesight had failed and he couldn't read that story. He was faking it, and he admitted to that afterwards that he had no idea what I wrote. And so and in addition to that sports editor coming out and asking who was married are the whole keys to my journalism career. And that's sometimes it happens that way, and sometimes other people work really hard to get it.
That's really interesting. Not a lot of people talk about the component of luck with career explorations. That's really insightful. Thank you for that. So you've briefly touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about like your college and your work experience that led up to your getting your first position?
Well, I think, I wasn't even intending to be involved in journalism in college. I was an English major, uh, thinking about going to law school, and didn't have a lot of extracurricular activities. My mother thought that I was spending too much time with friends she didn't approve of, and saw an ad in the student newspaper that I'd left around the house asking for reporters to join the newspaper staff. And so she kind of cajoled me into doing that. And it was so much fun that I just got into it, got very, very deeply into it. And mostly I was a movie reviewer and rock and roll reviewer, eventually became the entertainment editor on the paper, and won a couple of awards in my final year on the paper, which told me that maybe I could do this. And so I graduated, could not find a job. I was working on a car lot selling cars in the summer right after my graduation year. And when I got this call from someone saying they had these stringer openings that I told you about at the Orange County Register. And another funny twist was that I was such a terrible, terrible car salesman that the finance manager was sitting at his desk right next to where I got this phone call. And I held the phone, put the phone to the side, and I looked over at him and I said, the Orange County Register is offering me a stringer job. It's like $40 a weekend. And he goes, well, I'd take that job. And I go, why? And he held up my last check and he goes, because you don't work here anymore. I had done such a bad job. He was just waiting for a way to break it to me that he was firing me. So, I mean, it's just a lot of serendipity that happened during this period. But I was mostly focused on entertainment reviews. I didn't do any sports at all in college. And some news. We had to do everything. You had to do everything in college. But then I basically started as a stringer, and when I got and was put on part-time to do the stats, like everybody does agate. When you're young and you're the newspaper, you do agate, you do the stats. And from there, I had one beat before baseball, and it was part-time on the Los Angeles Lakers, Magic Johnson's first year, and they won the title that year, the NBA title that year. But I was so inexperienced that they took me off of it about halfway into the season and put a more experienced guy on it because they were so good and so popular. And I was just devastated. And so the story about, raising my hand because I wasn't married and the guy wanted a single guy on baseball, or a single gal, but it just happened to me was not married. That was my redemption. I mean, I was still scared. I didn't know if I would be able to do it because I knew that I had failed on the previous beat. And again, another life lesson, failing once is okay, but failing a lot of times probably isn't. And so I was blessed. And how many people get to have fun every day of their career? I got paid for 40 years to watch ball games. Plus, they spun me off over those years to go to Olympics. I went to Cuba with the Orioles, did some international travel. Sports writing is a wonderful gig, and the only sad thing about it is that because of the economic issues that have pressed down on the newspaper business, that a lot of the opportunities that I had to travel, to do stories that cost the paper lots of money, and sometimes thousands of dollars to send me to Havana to do a few days of coverage on something. Those opportunities aren't going to be presented to you for the most part because of what's happened with the media economy. And that's sad and saddens me. And I hope that doesn't end up being the case. But even so, it's a great business. And as you probably know from being in contact with the people you're being in contact with as you do this job with the association. A lot of great people, and it's a great business. And who knows where it goes from here. I mean, I went from typewriters all the way to being the top blogger in the Tribune chain for several years during the 2010s. You know, and like another important lesson learned for a 60-plus-year-old guy or a 55-year-old guy, that you have to adapt, and you'll find that you have to adapt to whatever you need. And for the young people, when I go to colleges and talk to classes, or high schools, my only message is that you study old-fashioned reporting, just so you know how to do that, and after that you master every possible platform. And so the only thing I do now, technically, the only thing I do now that's work and not retirement is I have a radio show on WBAL here in town once a week, and that's because I took that approach, and I made sure I knew how to handle that side of the business too. And so I don't know how long that's going to last. I've been doing it for like 15 years on the side. I'm kind of ready to be just goofing off, but we'll see how that goes.
Thank you. That was an amazing answer. So as you've expressed, you've really enjoyed your position over the past years. But I was wondering if you had like a favorite story from your time in the sports writing field.
Well, I've been asked that question a lot, and most of us in the business get asked that question, and I have to filter it through one of two, filters. Do you mean a favorite fun story or the most memorable story? Because they fall into different categories. I would say the most memorable story was not a happy story, and that was being in the upper deck for the World Series earthquake in 1989. And upper deck at Candlestick Park as it shook, and we wondered if that old ballpark was going to continue to stand there. And it was better to be on top, because the people in the press box was sandwiched between the two levels, and so I would have hated to be in that press box, wondering if it was going to get squashed. But we were on top of it, and then that led to spending the next week covering the earthquake and the news around the earthquake before they resumed the World Series 12 days later. So that's probably the most memorable. I was there in Atlanta for the Olympic bombing in 1996. Covered that story. I wasn't in the park when it went off, but I was in the park while there was still smoke coming up from it, and then spent that night all over Atlanta, chasing that story as a news story, and probably my favorite assignment, as mentioned earlier, was when the Orioles did their goodwill trip to Cuba in 1999. In January of that year, there was a State Department delegation that went to Cuba to negotiate the terms of that goodwill trip. And there was still very much tension between the U.S. and Cuba at the time. It was a real big deal. It was very controversial. The Orioles there were protest demonstrations at the Orioles minor league, spring training facility in Fort Lauderdale. Cuban people in Florida did not want them to make that trip. And I was told that the Cubans did not want any media on the trip from the U.S. And I was told at the Sun that if I was any kind of reporter, I would find my way onto that private jet. And so I cajoled Orioles owner Peter Angelos to basically explaining the historic nature of the trip. Peter Angelos' son was the logistics coordinator for the trip, and I convinced him that someone had to document this trip for posterity, because his son's was the first big thing he had responsibility given to his son Louis, and he bought it, and he put me in his delegation as a special assistant to the president of the Orioles. And we went to Cuba, and the funny thing about it was that the Cubans were not fooled. And so when you do a State Department delegation, everyone gets off the plane and they line up. And the Cubans greeting you, they all line up, and everybody shakes hands with everybody. So we're all lined up, and there's really high ranking, maybe the vice president, Cuba, wasn't the president, wasn't Fidel Castro, but gets to me and he shakes my hand and he says, welcome to Cuba, Peter Schmuck, special assistant to Peter Angelos from the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and then just continued on moving down the way. And I was banned from the meetings, but I basically was given an interpreter to tour Havana and talk to people and about the games and stuff like that. And then I got a briefing every day at 5 o'clock, but it was just a great trip, very memorable. And then we all went back for the games in March. And I think that would be the most, I think that would be my favorite assignment.
Awesome. Those are two multiple very interesting stories.
I'd probably say that because when you take the big events like Super Bowls and World Series, well, did 25 or 30 World Series, did eight or nine Super Bowls. So this was a one-time thing, and it was a historic thing. And I've been milking it every time there's a 5-year, 10-year anniversary. I've been milking it for columns and stories ever since.
Okay, so I have a fun question for you. When I was researching you, I discovered that at one point you tried to get a license plate that had your last name on it, and you were denied by the California DMV. And I wanted to know, did you ever get that license plate?
Yes, I did. And the story, I'll keep it short, is a girlfriend, I've since been married for 30 some years, but was a girlfriend at the time, got the vanity plates in California had 6 letters on them during the late 70s. And in 1980, they expanded it to 7 letters. My last name is 7 letters. So that was a birthday present. She got me a mock-up of it and she gave it to me as a birthday present. And I was waiting for it to arrive when I got a letter from the DMV that said, your request for a personalized license plate has been rejected because the word that you chose was offensive to public decency, crude and offensive to public decency. I was working at the Orange County Register at that time, and I thought it was funny, and so I took it in and I handed it over to one of their news people, who wrote a bright for the front page of the paper saying state refuses to license schmuck, and he won an award for that in the local press club for the best humorous short, and the fact that he called. The fact that he called Sacramento and tried to get quotes from the head of the DMV prompted them to say, oh, if it's his name, we'll take care of it. And then I got it in the mail probably a week or 2 later. But it was my 15 minutes of fame, because the next 2 days after that story ran, I was on every major FM station in the country called me and wanted an interview about that, because it's an FM kind of thing, morning show kind of thing.
It really is. That's a very interesting story. Thank you. So my final question for you, and you have been parting wisdom left and right in this interview for sure. But if you have any summary of what advice you would give for recent college graduates looking to get into the sports writing field, what would that be?
Well, couple things. Number one, on a philosophical level, it may be reflective of me being kind of a goofball sometimes, is every time I talk to young people, I point out that, number one, to get where you want to go, you got to work hard. But to want to get where you want to go, you got to have fun too. And so I really stress on that level to make sure you remain relaxed and realize that it is sports. It is the quote unquote toy department. It's okay to have a good time. I always had a good time during work and after. And that keeps the pressure down, because there is a lot of pressure, deadline pressure, particularly if you're a reporter covering a team. I was on deadline for 20 years, and then I got to be a columnist to get a little more time. As far as getting into the business, understand that the number of sports writers working for major newspapers in roles that are fun has declined dramatically over the last 15 years, which is sad. And I feel bad for the young people coming in, because they're not getting as much opportunity, as I said earlier, that they're spending a lot of time looking at a screen like we are right now, and in an office at the newspaper, where I would have gone wherever that thing was. but we have reached a point where finances are so tight that I had an instance a few years ago where I wanted to go to Philadelphia to do something, and they wanted me to calculate the mileage because they wanted to know how much the mileage was going to cost. I'm 90 miles from Philadelphia, and I was like, it was like, okay, we're through the looking glass now. We're worried about the mileage, but it's really has been that tight. I mean, our company went through bankruptcy. My previous company, Orange County Register, virtually almost folded a few years ago, and so it's going to be tough. And for young people in college in particular, I don't know that you have to have a college education. I knew people I came up with who didn't, but I had one. But what you really do need to do, and it was an option I never had because I was too stupid to know it existed, is doing what you're doing right now, which is internships. Internships lead to networking. They also, they also give you experience and a paper trail when you do a good job that it's quantifiable. So those things are important, but also, the great sports writers, and I am not one of the great sports writers, are obsessed with the sports that they want to cover, and so I do emphasize having fun, being relaxed, but you do have to win that derby for those jobs, because they're, like I said, there's a component of luck involved, and you'll need that to get where you want to go, or to get exactly where you want to go. My first bit of advice is take whatever job comes first. Don't turn one down because you don't like it, because the experience you get with a job you don't like is probably even better than the experience you get with a job you do, because you're going to have to adapt, you're going to have to adjust, you're going to have to learn skills you don't already have, because whatever you've been focusing on in college, you're going to be building those skills. And the other piece of advice that I give every young person I talk to is, don't make the mistake I made my first couple of years, which was worrying every day if I was as good as the guy sitting down the row in the press box. And I wasn't. I'm a young kid, but and I was working against these stars from LA Times and big papers. But still, I stress that when you get to that point, you would not be there if you weren't good enough. So you have to know you are good enough, or you wouldn't have the job, rather than sit there and say, should I have this job? Am I good enough to have this job? That's somebody else's choice to make. They hired you because they think you're good enough. So that means you are good enough. And it's important, because I tore myself up for a couple of years before I learned that lesson and was able to relax and enjoy the fact that I got this job that is such a great job.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I definitely learned a lot today from you, and I'm sure those that are watching did as well. But thank you so much, Mr. Schmuck, for taking the time to come and speak with us today. And thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.